certainly the amygdala, which is the part of the brain really from which fear sort of cascades outward. So when you experience something that either frightens you or terrifies you, the amygdala starts firing, and there are networks that branch out from the amygdala to various other parts of the brain. And one of the areas that the amygdala branches into is sort of back in the brainstem, and there are cells there that secrete norepinephrine and dopamine. And those are two neurotransmitters, and when they start flooding into the brain, they have a dramatic impact on the frontal lobes. And what they do is they really handicap the frontal lobes. And your frontal lobes essentially start, I don't want to say they stop functioning, but their ability to do all those things, those magical things that I was just talking about, degrades very, very quickly. And we can all experience this. If, I'm sure this sounds all very, kind of complicated, but if you just think about what happens if you're having a very, very, very stressful day at work, or you have to go into an exam, and on your way into the exam, something very stressful happens. All right, so you've been studying for weeks and weeks, and somebody says, "Hey, I just found out that they're not going to even test us on what we studied." And this is the exam that's going to determine whether or not you get into medical school or law school or something like that. And you are all of a sudden just flooded with anxiety and stress. And if in that moment you had to remember complex things or start, remember the things you studied, you'd find yourself, you'd getting more panicky, of course, because you'd find yourself thinking, well, I can't, my brain isn't working, right? I'm freezing. And what that is that's the frontal lobes really sort of in the process of shutting down, or at least being degraded. Now, so that's one aspect of how the brain responds to severe stress and fear. The other fundamental thing that happens is when the amygdala responds to a life-threatening stimulus and reacts, and norepinephrine and dopamine sort of are secreted into various neural circuits in the brain, it fundamentally alters how the brain processes what's going on. So we no longer encode experience in the same way. What the frontal lobes enable us to do with experience is it's not just the frontal lobes and the hippocampus, which is an integral part of memory functions. When they're functioning normally, they enable us to encode an experience in context, in sequence. And really, this is how most people think of memory. If you ask somebody, do you remember? Let's say you use an important, do you remember the day you got married? Do you remember the day you graduated from college? Or do you remember the day that, some important event, not a stressful event, not a traumatic event, just an important event. And they'll be able to remember things, details, and if you were to follow up with questions, says, well, all right, so it was something important, let's go back to the beginning of the day. All right, so what happened first? Where did you sleep that night? Where did you wake up? What did you do first? And people will be able to remember those details and remember them in sequence and remember them in context. And those are memories that are forged when the brain is functioning essentially normally. And again, it's because the frontal lobes are fully functioning and the hippocampus is fully functioning. When the brain is subjected to those stress hormones, when the amygdala is firing, when the person's experiencing something traumatizing, rather than remembering or encoding experience in that way, experience is encoded as intense fragments, and almost always they're sensory fragments. So you remember sights, you remember sounds, you remember smells. And you remember them so intensely, in fact, they are encoded so intensely that these are, of course, the kernels of what we will call flashbacks and nightmares. So you will wake up, if you have you're in a car accident, for example, a serious car accident, you may well wake up that night because all of a sudden you hear the sound of breaking glass. Or you may find yourself, you're sitting, and you take the cup of coffee up to in the morning to drink, and all of a sudden you have the intense smell of gasoline. And those are classic, of course, intrusive post-traumatic experiences. And what they are, those are the kernels of how the trauma has been encoded by the brain as these intense sensory fragments. And because the frontal lobes and the hippocampus and the thalamus and their functioning has been so degraded by those stress hormones, certainly in the immediate aftermath of a trauma, will have a great deal of trouble remembering the experience as some kind of sequential, fully contextualized event. And what you'll have is this whole scramble or jumble of very intense fragments, and you may really not be able to remember things in sequence or know what happened. So if somebody were to ask you, let's see, we'll go back to that car accident. If somebody were to ask you, okay, so, all right, so you heard the breaking glass, you heard a scream in the car, you smelt the gasoline. Now I need to know what happened first. So was it the screeching tires? Was it the screams? Was it the breaking glass? And you'll think, and of course what you'll do, what most people do, is you'll try to reason it through. You say, well, say, screeching tires first, all right, and then the breaking glass, and then somebody screamed. And do you really remember it that way? Well, maybe. Some people do. But it's also quite possible that that's simply taking those fragments and putting them into what seems like the most likely order. And of course that has a lot of implications for how we interact with victims of trauma, and the kinds of questions we ask of them and what we ask them to do in the wake of trauma, whether we are therapists, advocates, or whether we're law enforcement officers doing interviews with victims. These have tremendous implications for how we conduct those kinds of interviews and how we talk with victims. There is some evidence that allowing somebody who's been through a traumatic experience to go through a sleep cycle increases their capacity to remember certain facets of the experience. And that is becoming more the norm now. For example, when a law enforcement officer has been involved in some kind of shooting, and there's an automatic investigation, there's now more and more departments, the policy is to allow them to go through a sleep cycle before they are interviewed intensively about what happened. So that there's that sort of. But I think more fundamental and more important than the timing of the interview is how the interview is conducted. That if you understand how the brain is affected by traumatic experience, and if you understand that it is encoded the experience in these fragments, then you conduct the interview that way. And so rather than asking questions like, okay, I want you to tell me what happened, and I want you to start at the beginning. Recognizing that that's not how this person will have encoded the experience, you ask sensory-based questions. And so you ask, tell me everything that you could remember about what you smelled. And don't even worry about, she may remember something that happened after the rapist left first. Fine, take that down. Do you remember anything else that you smelled? Because what might happen from this? Well, she may remember a particular smell of whether it's a cologne, a deodorant, and you know what? She may remember it so vividly that you could actually identify the brand of deodorant that guy was wearing. That might have to actually end up being crucial forensic evidence. And you'll only get that by just methodically asking her question after question about these kinds of sensory fragments and going from there are 5 senses. Go from one to another to another. And so that's why that example that I gave earlier of the victim who was holding her hands, that was a sense. That was a sensory memory. It was a touch memory. right? And those kinds of memories, of course, are crucial in a rape investigation. Have you had any other sensations on your body? Are there any other parts of your body where you feel pain? Are there any other parts of your body where you feel pressure? Are there any questions like that? That's how the experience was encoded. If you ask those kinds of questions, you'll start to get their experience, their actual memories of the event, which will actually start to fill in crucial pieces, forensic pieces of this puzzle of what happened to this person. The issue of false allegations is it's a very controversial issue. There's a tremendous amount of sort of heat around this, and I think it's important to acknowledge that there's good reason for there to be concern about this, because being falsely accused of something is a terrible experience, and to be falsely accused of a sexual crime, it can be a catastrophic experience. So it's understandable that people have a great deal of concern about it. On the other hand, I think that concern has to be put in scale. We actually have a lot of research from around the world on just how frequently this happens. How frequently does somebody report a rape that never happened? All right, and I'm very familiar with the research. I did a study myself on this fairly recently, and the bottom line is that the best research puts that number at somewhere around 2 or 3% of reports of sexual assault reports. If you want to be very sort of conservative or liberal, depending on how you put it, somewhere between 2 and 8% at most, which means that over 90% of reports of rape are not fabrications, they're not false allegations. So we need to keep that in context. We need to keep that in perspective. Now, given that it happens very infrequently, it's actually extremely difficult to do any kind of systematic research that would allow you to say, well, if somebody's fabricating, they're more likely to say this, or and so we actually have no good research on this at all on which to base that kind of a conclusion. Unfortunately, there is in some law enforcement circles and in general an idea that if you apply certain standard techniques of interrogation, you can figure out if somebody is not telling the truth. And some of those, and one of the most common techniques, of course, is if you ask somebody to recount something that happened, right, and they give you their account. And then you ask them again, but you don't ask them to again, so okay, just tell me the same thing again. This time, the second time around, you might start from somewhere in the middle and say, okay, from that point, can you tell me again what happened after that? And then you might take them back to sort of maybe a third of the way through and ask them to go backwards. So now before that, what happened? And before that, what happened? And you do a series of questions like this. And the purpose of this is that it is true, if you're dealing with non-traumatic memory, and if somebody has fabricated something, this is a pretty good way to test whether or not they have their story straight. Now, if somebody really does a good job of preparing a story, they'll get through that kind of interrogation, all right? And that's not going to tell you whether they lied or not. If somebody didn't do a very good job of preparing, that's a pretty good way to try to trip them up and to see whether they start making mistakes, basically, in their account. But now, think about this in the context of the biology that I've just been talking about. If you're asking that kind of series of questions of a trauma victim who has only intense fragments and who, under pressure, might try to remember what happened first, what happened second, what happened third, because they're trying to be nice and trying to be cooperative. And in the meantime, you're seeing this as an interrogation technique to test whether or not they're lying. You're going to draw the conclusion that they're lying, because they can't answer those kinds of questions in that way. If so you arrive at a false conclusion. And so I think you know, if we're concerned about false allegations, in my experience, in the vast majority of cases, if there's a false report, it falls apart really quickly.